All right, we are live.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good afternoon. I'm Chair of the Utility Board, Tim O'Connell. I'll call the special meeting of the board to order. Mr. Kinder, who's going to be calling roll?
I will call roll. Sorry,
All right, go ahead.
My cursor over the right button. Chair O'Connell.
I am present.
Vice Chair Milton.
Present.
Board Member Majewski.
Present.
Board Member Marshall.
Present.
Board Member Lair.
Here.
Board Member Quantz.
Here.
Board Member Picorni.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. All present. Are there any members of the public that wish to address the utility board?
Not that I know of. No public comment this evening.
There are plenty of people in attendance, but I think we will be talking to them in the course of the agenda. Therefore, I will raise the approval of the minutes of the last meeting on September 13. Anyone want to present a motion to approve those minutes?
I'll move. I'll second.
Moved by Member Marshall, seconded by Member Majewski. Any discussion? Hearing none, I'll call for assent. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Anyone opposed? Aye. Anyone opposed? Hearing none. Okay, minutes are approved. And so that brings us to the next item of regular business, which is really the meat of why we are starting a little early. The discussion of stormwater, sewer, and water rates for next year. Jason, I'll turn it over to you. I presume the staff has some kind of presentation in mind.
Go ahead, Matt.
Good evening, Chair. This is Matt Mornick. Good evening, Utility Board. I'm the Finance Director with the City of Mercer Island. I just wanted to introduce the staff team that's been involved with the past 3 months of work. So first, I want to thank you for taking time on a Thursday evening to meet for this special meeting. Ben Schumacher, our financial analyst, has been coordinating a significant body of work with our consultant team at FCS for the past 3 months to present you with our utility rate adjustment recommendations for the next biennium for 2023 and 2024. Our recommendations fall in line with the work that we've done in the past with trying to maintain a smooth rate structure, smooth rate increases year over year, while simultaneously accomplishing all of the significant capital work that we have ahead of us in meeting our policy goals around financing this kind of work. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ben Schumacher. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Matt Mornick. So good evening, Utility Board. Ben Schumacher, financial analyst here with the City of Mercer Island. So I'll have Angie go ahead and start the presentation. Perfect. The thumbs up when you are to let us know you can see that. All right, so we'll get into it. So yeah, good evening. Super excited to be in front of you here tonight. It's a pretty jam-packed agenda, bringing rate recommendations for all three utilities of water, sewer, and stormwater. So let's dive right into it. So like Matt said, we brought in consultant FCS group. We actually retained them from the prior rate study in 2020. Hopefully their names seem a little familiar. It is the same team. Very excited to get the opportunity to work with them again. The focus of today's meeting is just going to be an overview of the rate setting process for each utility, kind of the key data inputs and assumptions that really drive the rate modeling process, and then a summary of those findings, and that will include the rate recommendations for water, sewer, and stormwater. As far as next steps go, just a reminder, keep in your mind that we are looking for the utility board to come to consensus on the rate recommendations tonight. If we do reach consensus, then they will go in front of City Council for the November 15th meeting, which is a Tuesday. As far as questions go, please ask them as they come up. We're not going to make you wait through all three utilities before asking anything. It's pretty information dense tonight, so please ask them as they pop into your head. And just to address, we did get the question of historical rates kind of before this presentation, which was asked at the last utility board meeting. We do have a slide that has historical rates for the past 10 years at the end of the presentation in what you would kind of call the appendix section. And that's really just to give you context of where we've been. The main goal of tonight is to focus on where we want to go for the next 6 years with a really keen focus on the next 2 years, so 2023 and 2024. So with that, go to next slide. And I'll pass it to Jason Kittner to talk a little bit about what makes this biennium unique.
So good evening, board members. We, as we've talked about for a handful of years now, we have some very important capital work on the horizon, the near-term horizon. That's all coming to the surface in the next biennium in particular. So in the proposed 2023-2024 preliminary budget, as you can see here on the slide, our expenditures over $67 million, of which 65% or 43.6 are tied to the utility funds. As we've talked about many times, the reinvestment in our aging infrastructure is critically important, as most of the systems were installed in the 50s and 60s, with an average useful life of 50 to 75 years, depending on the type, the material type, age, condition, break history, a number of different factors that go into the specific infrastructure that we're working on replacements. As we've talked about, those replacements are prioritized using a combination of factors. For example, on the water utility side, it's a combination of age of pipe, fire flow, type, material type, water quality is a component, combination with other projects. There's a number of different factors that are weighted as we go through our CIP prioritization on both the water and the sewer and the stormwater sides. On the last bullet here, you'll see, and I think I've mentioned this at a previous utility board meeting, we have a new program identified in the preliminary capital improvement program on the water utility, in particular to replace our remaining AC pipe or asbestos cement pipe that's in the distribution system. As I believe there's just over 4 miles, if I'm not mistaken, of AC pipe left. And over the course of the next 6 years within the water fund, we are prioritizing this replacement to get this material out of our distribution system and replaced. On the sewer side, we have some similar challenges, but that work is a little bit slower in terms of actual construction. Dollar amounts are still programmed for future construction, but that the sewer side is being slowed down a bit with the SCADA implementation. As the utility board knows, we've been working through our SCADA replacement project, and a lot of the data that we will be receiving on the SCADA side and the sewer side will feed future reinvestments in our sewer infrastructure. So we have future infrastructure needs on the sewer side. They're different. They're being a little bit slowed just because we want that data to come in before we actually apply it to full-blown construction projects. What does that mean? Well, part of the sewer system is we have 17 pump stations that convey sewage around our island. And so, again, those pump stations are range in age and type and condition. And based off the data and the flows and the conditions of those pump stations, it will feed future rehabilitation projects at those pump stations in out years for the capital program. Additionally, on the sewer side, we have this lovely, wonderful, fabulous sewer line called the Lake Line system. This is just over 13 miles of sewer lake line. It is what it sounds just as it is a sewer pipe that is on the shores of Lake Washington under the water. As we've talked about a number of times, it can be problematic and challenging to get in to maintain. An additional investment reconnaissance work is necessary to determine how we go about identifying the replacement schedule for this lake line, as well as additional operation and maintenance components to servicing this line. So lots of capital work on the near horizon. We've been talking about it for many years. It's all great stuff. It's programmed in the next 6 years, with a lot of it in the first 2 years of the 6-year capital program. So with that, I will pass it to Angie.
Wonderful, thank you. So my name is Angie Sanchez. I'm with FCS Group, and I have with me Chase Bezette, who is also project analyst on the job. And so as questions come up, Chase will be there and available to help answer some of the questions as well. And so as has been discussed, we have been working on a rate study update for the last few months. Really what that rate study is intended to do is develop a multi-year financial plan that evaluates the sufficiency of utility rates to meet its overall financial obligations on a standalone basis. And so when we're really talking about a standalone basis, what we mean there is that each of the utilities fees are sufficiently set so that we can meet all of the operating costs and operating obligations of that particular utility. Those obligations consist of direct costs such as operating costs, capital improvements, and debt service. But we're also looking at various different fiscal policies, so ensuring that we have appropriate reserves for our utilities, ensuring that we're meeting various different financial metrics such as debt service coverage requirements, should we have any, or other policies that have been outlined for the city. Through those particular elements, we can then identify what our revenue requirement is for each of the annual evaluations that we're completing for each of the utilities. At that particular time, we then evaluate if existing revenues are sufficient. If they are not, then we develop an annual rate strategy, again, trying to really balance our overall financial needs with minimizing customer impacts. For this particular study, our main focus is going to be on the 2023-24 time period. However, we are kind of taking a bit of a preview when we're looking out further, and so you'll get a glimpse of what our projections are out through the year 2028. But again, the 2-year period, 2023 through 24, is really where we have our eyes set. In terms of the fiscal policies, and why we begin with fiscal policies is that they really do help guide the rate study process in terms of the framework for which we're starting our analysis. The city does have a number of different fiscal policies that we're looking at and working into the analysis. So our operating reserve policy to provide sufficient cash flow on a daily basis. We have various different metrics for each of the utilities, water, sewer, and stormwater. You can see there they range from 30 to 90 days. With water being a little bit on the higher side simply because the revenue is more volatile in terms of subject to weather volatility. And so we keep a bit more on the water side for that particular purpose. Our capital reserve, sometimes what we like to think of as more of a savings account to provide a source of funding for emergency repairs or unanticipated costs. We set that at about 1% of capital assets for each of the utilities. One of the more important elements that we had talked about during the last study and have included and continue to really try to get closer to our target is rate funded system reinvestment. And you can see there, that's the third one down in the particular fiscal policies. You'll also know that acronym RFSR. You're going to see that as we move through the slides. And so I do want to kind of point that out when you see that acronym, this is what we're talking about. It is really to ensure system integrity through reinvestment in the system. So we are trying to ensure that our ongoing rates do have a specific element in them or capacity in them. So they're not only meeting our operating costs and our debt service requirements, but they're also able to cash fund some of our capital obligations in any given year. And so we are attempting again to meet our various different policies, set points for each of the utilities, and we will go through them as we touch each of the utilities in specifics. And so we are continuing on that path again, trying to get to our target levels, not quite at the 100% mark yet. Capital funding decisions, again, as we were looking at our capital plans and looking at the full body of work that is before us in terms of our utilities, we are looking at what may make sense in terms of debt financing versus cash financing. And so the city does look at cash funding projects when possible under $2 million and really looking at external funding for those projects $2 million and above. If we are to secure debt, we are looking again to ensure that we're making and maintaining our metrics. Our financial ability to repay debt is our debt service coverage requirement. There we have a minimum requirement generally through covenants of about 1.25. It is nice to target something slightly higher, again, about 2.0, simply because if we do enter the bond market, we want to have the city positioned as favorably as possible. And then finally, rate equity. This is somewhat unique to the city. We wish more utilities had this in place, and that's really just to ensure that rates and charges are equitably recovered from utility customers. And again, there it's really focusing on, do our current fees of each of the utilities, can they meet the overall financial obligations of each of the utilities on a standalone basis? And so that's kind of the framework that we're working within when we begin the rate study process. In terms of our key data inputs and assumptions, so as we mentioned, the 2023 through 28 time period is what we're going to be looking at and providing some graphics around, but really the focus being on the next couple of years for the biennium. Our rate revenue has used the budget figures for sewer and stormwater because they are fairly stable and are fairly consistent. However, staff did take a little bit more of a deeper dive on the water utility for 2022 to ensure that his history in terms of the weather that we were seeing, what type of revenue and revenue volatility were we seeing historically, and making sure that we are comfortable that we are projecting our overall water revenues at a consistent and stable basis based on the weather year. So the year did start out a little bit wet and a little bit cooler. And so we wanted to make sure that we were again using very similar weather forecasting in order to set those particular water revenue rates. In terms of our operating expenses, and we'll again show these more specifically in each of the utilities, we are looking at the 2023-24 preliminary budget figures. They do include, Seattle water purchases and King County treatment costs that were forecasted independently through our analysis. Both of those particular utilities do have anticipated future rate increases, which do impact the results of each of the utility financials that we'll be showing you this evening. And again, we're incorporating the city provided capital improvement program. There in particular, again, we do have a large body of work. And so we did want to focus on, what does that mean for each of the utilities, project that out and identify what would be the best source of funding for each of those capital programs, and how do we execute those capital programs with the available funding. So now I'm going to turn specifically to each of the utilities. We're going to talk about water first. We'll go into sewer and then stormwater. The format will be very similar for each of the utilities. So once we kind of get through one of the utilities, you kind of see a little bit about how this particular format is laid out. The first one, again, we'll start with is water. We are looking at 2022 through 2028 time period. And here we're simply looking at the operational forecast. We are going to add on, kind of as we go out slide through slides, we're going to add capital next, and then we'll combine them all together to identify what the total water system obligations are and our revenue requirements. And so we see here in terms of our operating costs for these bars, we have our obligations. So working from the bottom, operation and maintenance expenses. You can see here about $3.6 to $4.4 million. We have Seattle water purchases, which account for approximately about 40% of our overall revenue requirement for the utility, which is fairly significant. Now, based on information that we have available, we are increasing Seattle water costs at about 5% per year. What you'll see the increases in terms of the operating and maintenance costs are what was identified in the memorandum that was provided by the city. And we're looking at some additional staffing needs of a utilities engineer, staffed by the water utility, and partial funding of the capital projects inspector. And so that's kind of why you see a little bit of a tick up here in 23 and 24, and then they kind of stabilize over time. Again, the Seattle costs are increasing at about 5% per year. And so that's why you see that increasing as well. And then finally, we have a little small amount of existing annual debt service at about $110,000 per year, which stays throughout the rate forecast. It looks like I have a question.
You do, and it's Tim O'Connell. The projected increases in SPU water purchases, is that all just rate increases from Seattle, or are you projecting increases in overall consumption?
It is all just rate increases. We are actually keeping growth fairly static in terms of the utility.
Thank you.
Okay. Now we're going to switch to the capital program. And again, this is where we have had discussions in terms of just the overall capital needs that the utilities are facing. So again, here, 22 through 28 are really focusing on 23 forward. You can see that it is a bit front loaded in terms of the capital needs, and kind of does a little bit of a peaks and valleys here and there. When we're looking at our overall obligations for the time period, it is about $75 million in capital spending that we're looking at. Some of the larger capital projects that you'll see we have listed here, the annual asbestos cement main replacement, some other main replacements, the metering replacement program at about $7.4 million. And so we do have a number of different projects and initiatives that are happening and being accelerated that for the water utility that is causing these various different peaks in 2023 and 24. In terms of funding for that particular capital program that we have outlined, you can see here we have this dotted line, and this is the system reinvestment funding that we had mentioned that, again, our rates are contributing on an annual basis a certain amount of capital funding available every year to go towards capital needs. Our capital needs are greater than those particular funding sources, but the good news is that we are able to fund about 56% from our existing reserves, from cash that we're funding through this system reinvestment policy, and connection charges from new customer payments connecting to the system. However, again, our capital program needs are larger than what we have. And so we have anticipated that about $33.3 million in financing, or about 44% in order to execute the capital program. Again, we're looking at the entire time period, not just the 2-year time period. Those funding sources, again, that $33.3 million, the plan would be about $19.1 million in 2023, followed by the potential for $8.1 in 2025 and $6.1 million additional issue in 2027. That would add about 1.4 to 2.6 million in new annual debt service if we, again, continue on this particular path of these various different assumed debt issues. Again, really, we're focusing on 23 and 24, so that 19.1 is really what we may be looking for in the immediate future before we would then recalibrate and identify what is needed in the future. Another question?
Yeah, Angie, I'm new to the board, so I apologize if you've had to explain this to other people previously. The rate-funded system reinvestment policy, I'm not sure I fully understand. I'm sure I do not fully understand that. So we're taking monies out of current rates to save for future capital expenditures?
It can be saved for future capital expenditures, but because our needs are greater than our annual funding. So again, this is our annual funding that we have here that we're trying to phase in over time to our target. Because our capital needs are greater, we are using flat financing, and we're using other revenue sources such as existing reserves that you may have accumulated in order to fund our overall peaks and valleys of our capital program. Really what that, I think you have about pretty much right on the nose, which is really what that is. It's saying we charge a certain dollar amount per month for water utility service. That revenue that's coming in is not only meeting our operating costs, it's meeting our debt service requirement, any taxes that we have. But we also want to have some left over to pay for our capital that is being essentially worn out by existing ratepayers. And so it's kind of like a little bit of like a depreciation funding amount almost, but we're calling it system reinvestment funding. And we're trying to target a certain amount to make sure that we do have a good balance of cash and financing for our capital.
All right, thank you.
Angie, this is George. I have a question.
Okay.
There's about a $10 million drop between 2024 and 2026. Is that because the heavy lifting is being completed in 2024?
There are definitely a lot of larger projects. I might have Jason weigh in on that particular project, but yeah, there are a lot of larger projects. So the meter replacement program is kind of in those particular time slots, the booster system improvements. So there's been some projects that have been accelerated a bit that would be ending and not carried on annually, but they're specifically just for, going to be constructed in those particular 2 years.
Yeah, we have some. Yeah, so Angie, you're right on. There's a couple of really large capital projects. You name a couple of them. Another one that comes to mind is the relining of the reservoir tanks. We have both the north and the south tank to reline, which are pretty significant capital costs on the next 23 and 24. That's why those bar charts are higher.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Is there another question? Looks like we have Steve and Meredith, maybe.
Yeah, I did have one question on the this kind of transition from more of a debt-funded system reinvestment to a rate-funded. Is that something that the council kind of specifically decided or chose to do? Is that a staff kind of best practice? What is the kind of the drive towards moving to this kind of rate-funded reinvestment policy?
I can answer some, and then we can absolutely let the city staff weigh in as well. And so the system reinvestment funding is something that we have talked with all of our clients about in terms of really making sure that we're repairing and replacing our systems as we go out over time. So we can all hear about the deferred maintenance that's happening all over the United States and probably the world in terms of our infrastructure. And this is one way in order to help try to keep up with a bit of that, is to make sure that, again, every year we're setting aside funds so that we have funds available to help fund our capital projects. Because many times what happens is that when we are constrained with our revenue, the first thing to go is capital. The capital gets cut, and we were not executing any capital in that particular year. And so this is really our way and the council's way of being able to keep up with some of those repair and replacement projects. Again, ensuring that we are dedicating a certain amount for that repair and replacement of the system. And I guess I know we started this initially in 2020. I recall there being a budget policy level target amount that was implemented. I'm not sure if it was before the 2020 time period that was implemented, but it has been part of the rate studies that I know I have been involved in.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I don't remember the kind of the terminology or that, and certainly seeing the balance level on that reinvestment target has going up, and seeing that in the budgets that were provided. That's why I was curious if this was a specific target that's being set at city council level or at city, financial staff level. That was what I was kind of curious about. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think it is a budget level a target that we're trying to work towards. And for the water utility, I believe it is trying to get to about 3.9 million in annual funding. So
this is O'Connell, unless if someone else had their hand raised, I didn't see it. No. All right. I am still struggling a bit with the rate funded system, and then this is sometimes I'm guilty of reading ahead, and I'm looking at Ben's memo about the water rates, and the water utility capital program is described on page 2 of that, and the bottom line water utility capital improvement is $13,369,000. On your graph here, Angie, it's over. I can't tell just looking at the bar chart, but I can tell that it's over 40 million. Mm-hmm. So can you explain what's the difference in the calculations here?
Yeah, and it could be, and we can make sure that I'm saying this so Ben can weigh in as well. So when we generally receive capital improvement programs, they're in today's dollars. And when we're looking at financial planning, we are escalating to the year of construction. Mm-hmm. And so those costs would be greater in a future year than maybe what we have if we're expressing them in 2022 dollars, because we are adding inflation factors for each year that those particular projects are included.
I think Angie has it exactly right.
So even though in the rate study, the 2024 today dollars is whatever under 12 million, that the assumed rates for inflation over the next number of years were enough to
bump that up,
add that much more in the 2024 kind of localized dollars.
Correct.
Or,
and
what were those assumption lines? Sorry, for the assumed inflation rates that you guys were using.
And I'll ask Chase if you can look that up for us in our spreadsheet. That would be wonderful, so I don't speak out of place here. As he's doing that, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this system reinvestment funding, because it seems like it's maybe still a little bit elusive in terms of what we're trying to, again, intended to do. The overall objective, again, is to try to get a balance between how much the water fund is able to fund through cash funding versus debt funding. And so there is a target set so that, we are trying to provide funding on an annual basis. We're starting at about $3.2 million, again, increasing to about 3.9. If we did not have that particular element or that particular target in place, we would likely be funding more through debt, or we would have to defer our capital projects because there would not be enough funding available currently in order to pay for our capital program. So really, this is just a way to provide additional funding and a balance between the cash and the debt funding that would be required to execute the capital program.
Yep. And Angie, I can hop in on that escalation factor. So our assumption in 2023 is 6%, and that was talked about with staff quite in depth based on the timing of when we got the CIP kind of mid-year this year. We knew that there was already some of the higher inflation baked in, but we still wanted to capture a little bit higher than the historical average. So we're using 6% in 2023, and then 3% kind of more of the historical average from 2024 forward.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Chase. And then I get kind of a follow-up question to from the rate study side. You mentioned that we're kind of moving from a 3 million to a 3.9 million in the water system reinvestment target. And it looked like you basically, can you hit that kind of a 3.9 million number in about 2026? So 2026, 27, 28, we're at that 3.9 million, but it's flat at that 3.9 million. Is that the way that this kind of reinvestment target will work? Is that we're kind of looking at this, I don't know if this is a 50-year system, a 2% annual reinvestment fund to try and kind of keep up with system value through time? Is that kind of a way to summarize it?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good question. What the target was actually it set it at a certain dollar amount. And so we have kept that dollar amount consistent and flat. Once it is met, which as you alluded to is about 2026 time period is when we meet that 3.9 million for the water utility. And so that has been kept flat. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're not able to fund any more capital within that through cash. It just means that that's the kind of the burden we're placing on rates is to at least fund that 3.9 million in any given year.
Understood, because there is still an element of larger projects being debt funded in addition to the, gotcha.
Okay. Any other questions? Perfect.
Thank you.
So bringing the two pieces together, we have slide 10 here, which is the summary of the water revenue requirement. And there's a bit going on the slide, and so I'll kind of talk us through it. Big picture, the bars are going to be the obligations, and so both the operating and how we're going to fund capital obligations. The lines are our revenue sources. And so the solid line here is revenue at existing rates. So if we absolutely did nothing with rates, we left them at the current level they are today in 2022, this would be the amount of revenue that we have available to meet our obligations. Because we have our obligations and various different assumptions happening with them, you can see that the bars actually increase. So the dotted line is really identifying what we need in order to be able to meet our overall financial obligations. And so really it becomes, how do we fill in this gap in order to, again, looking forward, meet our overall obligations. And so then working through, and I'll start with 2023 from the bottom up here, what we have is the operating and maintenance expenses as we showed them in the previous slides. And again, that includes the FTEs and cost of living adjustments. We have our Seattle water purchases increasing at 5% per year. We also layer on top of that our existing debt service is a little sliver. It's not a whole lot, it's about $110,000 per year, but it does carry on throughout the time period. And here in the gold is when we start looking at that new debt service in order to help fund some of that capital program that we see that was a bit front loaded in these two particular years. And so as you can see here, we have debt starting in 2023. It then bumps up in 2025 and again in 2027. Again, these are planning at this particular point. Really the focus is on the 2023 and 24 time period that we have there. And our debt is about 1.4 million, staying about 1.4 in 23 and 24 before it increases to about 2.1 and then 2.6 as we secure those additional financings out over time, should we continue on with them. The green here is what is represented in the system reinvestment funding, or that policy that we've been talking about. And so again, here we have a $3.2 million. It increases to 3.5, 3.7, and then stabilizes at about 3.9 million once it's hit in 2026. You will note that there's kind of some grid line bar here. That is additional capital that needs additional cash funding. And so again, if we didn't have additional capital funding needs beyond our, what we're financing and our policy, our dotted line would just be, hitting this particular green line. Because we have some additional capital funding needs, we've only identified a certain number of capital that would be financed. There is some additional requirement for cash funding of our capital to execute the program as stated. And so that's really what this grid is representing there as well. So our existing revenue is sufficient to cover all of our operating costs through 2027-28. But really what is happening is, in order to fill in this gap, we're looking at about an 8% annual rate increase, driven by, again, that rate-funded system reinvestment policy and the additional financing that is required to execute the capital program as scheduled. I'll stop there just for a minute, just to let it soak in a bit.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And again, for my fellow board members, I don't mean to be monopolizing. Will, go right ahead, please.
Well, if this is a bad direction, then let me know. But my question is, what level of risk mitigation is baked into these recommendations? So funding to cover known existing rehab and replacement needs, plus, unknown needs that will certainly come up. How much is that baked into these recommendations?
We do have various different reserves. And so, as we mentioned, the operating reserve we have, but that's mainly for, operating ebbs and flows. And we do have a 1% asset replacement kind of target for our capital fund. So for unknown type of projects that may come up that we may need funding for, we have that particular reserve as well that we're watching. I can have Chase look at that particular number for the water utility if you'd like the specifics on that, but there are reserve fundings that we have available, not significant, but something that, could potentially cover some of that ebbs and flows for unexpected costs.
Yeah, I guess to piggyback on that, we're seeing, in this big high inflation environment, costs are just really going up a lot of things. Is that kind of thought about when you did this analysis?
Yeah, and even as staff had mentioned, we're hit with inflation based on the cost of living adjustments that have been included in the budget already for the 6% each year in terms of 23-24. We have, as Chase mentioned, we escalate those capital costs at about, I think you mentioned 6% in 2023, going down, to more 3% levels in 2024. So as we're anticipating capital projects, we're assuming 2023 is still going to have a high inflationary level. So that has been included in this particular analysis as well. And then just in general, our operating costs for 25 and further do include some level of CPI adjustments, simply because again, we want to make sure we're keeping with costs.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm curious if this is the time to talk about it, great. If not, if it's later, that's fine too. To discuss, particularly when we look at this bar chart, it appears that what is driving some of the slope in that line are increased capital expenditure. And so, particularly if we go back to the previous slide, we've got a fairly substantial debt for this biennium, but less than a half of that in the out bienniums, where we're talking about some of the increased capital requirements. And I'm curious why the assumption is built in that we're going to incur 20 million of debt in this biennium, but less than half of that in the out bienniums, which is driving this smooth 8% rate increase.
And it goes in terms of how the capital has been scheduled. And so staff, if Jason, again, you may want to discuss a little bit about how those particular priorities are scheduled in terms of the overall capital improvement program. But again, we look at that capital improvement program that is provided and identify what those financial obligations are in that particular time period to ensure that we have sufficient funding to execute the program based on that schedule.
Yeah, and just to talk on the capital program in 23 and 24, there are some pretty big capital dollars associated with projects. We have the meter replacement project that's been approved and is moving forward. That's got a pretty big capital hit to it. The benefit of that, obviously, though, is on the revenue side, where our unaccounted water loss numbers should decrease, which means there should be additional revenue that comes in based off those meter implementation that will take place. We also have the 2 reservoir tanks that I talked about earlier being relined. You know, those are around $2 to $3 million each. We have the AC pipe replacement program, and then, you know, there's just the capital work that we have on the horizon is programmed accordingly because of, and Will asked about risk, right? So these projects are being prioritized because there's a risk to this work not getting done. It's important that we do it in this biennium. That's why they're programmed that way. They're just the way the capital laws are hitting, and then 23 and 24, they're just larger cost projects as it comes down to it than the out years.
This is George. Is the 8% annual rate increase, is that per year from 2023 to 2028?
Yes, and I can go to the next slide. We might kind of outline it just a little easier here for you. Let me see there. It'll show you kind of the rate path, but again, really the concentration is on the initial 2 years. And so what you're seeing here is a bi-monthly sample single family bill. And so here's the bi-monthly bill, and then we have the monthly bill here at 6108. I'll focus on the monthly simply because it's sometimes a little easier to focus 1 month at a time. So the sample monthly bill currently is 6108, and that would increase to 65,897 for 2023. And then if that additional 8% was included, it'd be 7124. And so it would be annually an increase in the monthly rate of $4.89 to $5.27 for those 2 years.
Thank you.
So in terms of the water summary, so the rate increase were at about 8%. Here again, as we've shown the previous, $4.89 per month in 2023. As is practice for the city, there will be a mid-biennial review so that the 2024 rate adjustments can be discussed, checked, and calibrated as necessary before various different approvals will be requested. But really, again, the key drivers there, as we all have been discussing, here is the near-term capital investment needs. There is a large body of work that is needed in terms of the overall utilities, water obviously being one of them. The increased recent inflation has not helped any in terms of not only the cost of living adjustment increases, but also additional staffing needs and also capital cost increases. And so they happen on both the operating and capital side of things. And then we are looking at, because of the higher or larger capital program, a requirement for more debt financing and financing needed to fund the capital program. And so with that, I'll pause a little bit as well, because the next slide will be working into the sewer utility. And we'll have plenty of time at the end as well to be able to answer questions if you'd like to continue. Okay.
Angie, I'm going to jump in real quick and just add a point to the question raised by Chair O'Connell. I just want to go back and to the question you raised about debt financing and how we have identified significant funding requirements for outside funding in the upcoming biennium, and that number decreases in out bienniums. The Chief of Operations, Jason, and I, when we were working on this with our consultant team, we really wanted to identify projects for each utility where there was a clear benefit to doing debt financing, meaning that spreading out the costs over a 20-year period made sense given the utility, the improvements that were being made to the utility systems, and so that those benefits, those reinvestments would benefit not only the current ratepayers but future ratepayers, so that there was a combined contribution that not only current ratepayers were paying for that added benefit, but future generations as well. So we were looking for projects that had a useful life beyond at the very minimum for a 20-year period, if not longer. And so that was part of the calculation that went into selecting which projects could receive outside funding. And it also kept our rates lower by going out sooner rather than later.
Oh, yeah, and Matt, I hope you did not misunderstand the thrust of my question. I'm all in favor of it. Your predecessor had a great deal more reticence to debt financing, and I happen to think that the point you make of what I refer to sometimes as generational equity is extremely sound. The thrust of my question was a little different. If a smoothed 8% rate increase necessary to fund anticipated further capital developments in the out biennia, why are we saying that we're only going to make a debt financing in out biennia that is half of what we're prepared to do in this biennia? And I'll just be real candid. I mean, the reason I'm asking is an 8% increase as far out as the eye can see, I find very disturbing. I mean, we're talking about increasing rates by 60% over the course of this plan. That's a lot of money to be asking the ratepayers to be spelling out. If a portion of it is something that in fact could be spread out over a longer period through, and that's why I'm asking the question, what might be more appropriate levels of debt financing?
Well, this was our fully baked recommendation, taking a look at the 6-year capital program and the needs over during that period of time. So we really looked at what projects really made sense for financing while using it strategically, going out for strategic outside funding, but not overburdening the system, because the current policy in place is the pay-as-you-go policy. And that's the policy that we've inherited. That's what we're working with. That's why you've seen the reinvestment targets for building up reserves to pay for capital needs. And so we could revisit that, but right now the recommendation you have in place takes out over $30 million for the water fund, for the water utility, to get a significant body of work done. But if the utility board wants to see an alternative version of what the rate increases or rate adjustments could look like, we could take that feedback back and potentially present an alternative.
Thank you.
Just one last question, or I guess comment on you were talking about the prioritization of the capital improvement projects being, looking at for funding, anyways, for debt funding, being based on looking at them being 20 long-term projects. Within the capital investment plan now, other than I guess software as a part of the SCADA update or something like that, that would be, isn't pretty much everything in the water system kind of being built that's 20-year plus investments, whether it's water main replacements or even like linings on the towers and stuff.
Yeah, on the water system side, your lifespan, expected useful lifespan for the infrastructure that's being replaced is yes, it's longer than 20 years, other than, as you referred to, like your software for your SCADA and things like that. But yeah, the infrastructure that's on the ground has a longer than 20-year lifespan.
So there is that opportunity in a sense to look at some of these things as being longer term investments that would be could be considered appropriate for debt financing. It's just a matter of kind of where we draw that line between what we want to try and finance out of the running operations and out of the debt financing.
Correct.
Okay. Moving on to the sewer revenue requirement. And again, we'll have another opportunity to go back and ask questions. So in terms of the sewer utility, as mentioned before, the format is very similar to how we structured the water discussion. And so here we're looking at specifically operational forecast initially. The total operating costs about $8.9 to $11.4 million through the time period that we're looking at here, with the O&M expenses working from the bottom at about 2.6 to 3.2 million. Again, does include the COLA adjustments. And for the sewer utility, it really is including a partial funding for the capital projects inspector have also been included in the budget. Really what dominates in terms of the operating costs on the sewer side is the King County treatment costs. There are about over 65%, about 67% of the operating budget, and are at the level of about $5.2 to $7.5 million. Now, interesting enough, with the King County forecast that we have and the best of our ability, it looks like they are assuming a 5.76% annual increase, 2023 through 2027. It actually may even jump up to 9% in 2028, and that is what we actually have included here as well. And so that's kind of why you see kind of it always ticking up, and then it ticks up a little bit higher on this back end. And then finally, we have the existing debt service beginning at about 1 million, reducing over time to about 600,000 as a specific debt falls off. And I believe that's a Lakeline replacement project debt ends in 2026. And then further into 2029 is the remaining debt of the LPGO for Lakeline completion. So again, past this period 1 year, we're also going to have the other debt fall off for that. Looks like we have a question.
Yeah. What is King County communicating in terms of what's behind their projected rate increases, and how does it account for, I mean, there's some regulatory scenarios that could drive some significant additional capital improvement investments that King County is going to need to make. How are they factoring those scenarios into what they're forecasting?
Jason, I see you popped up. Did you?
Yeah, so you are correct, Will. King County has some pretty significant capital and infrastructure investment needs as well. They actually proposed this rate structure about a year to 16 months ago, and they delayed it during the COVID pandemic. They're slowly starting to reinvest in their infrastructure needs as well. And there are, just like many other utilities, cities around the region, like the city, Mercer included, they have infrastructure replacement needs. And so they are programming those through their capital program. And it's tied to their asset reinvestment strategy and policies that they have in place as well. So, but yes, I anticipate that the King County costs will probably grow as well during this time span as well.
And following on that, just before we leave this slide, you said that there's some anticipation that in 2028 it's going to jump even more. And what is the driver of that?
That I do not know in particular. Chase, I don't know if you have any information on that. This was just the forecast that we had received from them.
No, but we can look into it.
Yeah, I don't have any specific information, but kind of the nice thing with the way that Mercer Island bills is you bill the customer directly for King County as well, and then just pay it to King County. So it essentially does ask it or look like a pass-through with a revenue and matching expense. And so you'll see that the revenue requirement slide in a couple slides looks a little different, and it looks like your rates are actually growing over time under current rates, just because your King County is growing where your local charge would not be growing. So,
good point. Thank you, Chase.
And do I understand correctly that the 228, did I hear you say you built in the anticipated increase?
Yes, we did. We had built in that 9% forecast that we had.
So you'll be seeing the increase in the revenues and the expenses if we're just looking at the treatment portion. So what you're going to really see in the difference is the local portion that would be increasing with rates.
Okay. Moving to the capital program on the sewer side of things, again, same time period, 22 through 2028. There is a slight peak here in 2023, but really what we're looking at is a little bit more backloaded in terms of the sewer utility. For 2023, in terms of these particular projects, what we have included there for scheduling is the SCADA system replacement, pipeline renewal and replacement program, about $550,000 per year, some sewer pipe replacement and upsizing as well. Really what you're seeing here in terms of capital costs is the lake line locating and line conditioning assessment and some hydraulic modeling and pump station rehab. So this is kind of where most of this lake line stuff is happening. Here is more of some of the SCADA system and pipeline repair and replacement. Similarly to water, this is again that rate funded system reinvestment policy for the sewer system. Here again, the target is $2 million, and so we're increasing from 1.7 to $2 million, being able to support that in any given year. Again, we do reach that by the year 2026. About $30.2 million in capital spending throughout this time period. When we're looking at how that particular capital program will be funded, we have about 64%, or about $19.2 million being available from cash, again, rate funding, existing reserves and connection charges, and other potential revenue sources. And here in terms of financing, about 36%, or $11 million anticipated in debt financing. That is assumed to be in two issues, 3.7 million in 2025 and about 7.3 necessary in 2027. Again, that will be revisited. But what if moving forward with that particular financing assumption, it would increase the new annual debt service from about $300,000 to $850,000. And as Chase alluded to, bringing the operating and the capital funding requirements together, we have very similar format. Again, bars are our expenses. Solid line is our existing revenue amount, which does include more of the pass-through of that King County revenue, as well as our overall needs funded, identified by the dotted line and the gap that really we need to be recovering to meet our needs. Working from the bottom, we have our operating and maintenance expenses. The King County treatment, again, you can see they're increasing. We have existing debt, and again, that existing debt also is reducing slightly in that year 2027, as we had mentioned before on the operating slide. New debt service is not anticipated until 2025 and 2027, so you can see in the gray bar there. And what we look at again is our system reinvestment policy being phased in, reaching its target at about 2026 and staying at that particular target at that $2 million mark. And again, the additional amount here in the grid line bar is again the additional funding that would be required from cash to fund our and execute the capital program as scheduled. With this particular summary, very similarly, we're meeting our operating costs throughout the forecast. So again, really the driver is the rate funded system reinvestment policy that we're trying to continue to phase in, and the additional financing that would be needed to fund our capital program.
And sorry, just to be, so this is what you were talking about before, that the 4.5% again is the local rate increase. So it's actually only a part of the rate increase that the customer will see, because the King County treatment piece is passed along directly. So they'll see the 5.76 to 9 on that through time, in addition to the 4.5 of this.
Yeah, and this probably will help explain that a little bit better as well. So here, and we've included monthly, we do have the bi-monthly detail in the appendix, and that will be provided. Again, that single family bill. So we have the local portion of the bill here at the very top, followed by the treatment portion, and then the total. So here you can see there's that local portion of the 4.5%. And so that's about $1.41 to $1.47 in the 2 years that we're looking at. The treatment bill, however, does include that 5.75. And so it's $2.84 to $3. And so the combined bill that the customer would see from the local and treatment is about $4.25 to $4.47. And that's that melded kind of the 5.27% increase. But really what we have control over in terms of the city is the 4.5. Okay. And summary of the sewer. So again, the local rate increases needed in 23 and 24, about 4.5% in each year, equates to about $1.41 per month in 2023. King County increases are the bulk of that particular increase at 5.76%, excuse me, in 2023 and 2024. to the tune of about $2.84 in 2023. Again, mid-year biennial review for 2024 local rate adjustments. So we have really just focused on the 2023 here. Key drivers, very similar to water, are the system capital reinvestment needs, our increased inflation, both operating and capital, and the addition of the financing requirements to fund the capital program and execute it as scheduled. Pause there for a moment.
Further questions? Not seeing any hands raised. Angie, you want to go ahead?
Okay. As been mentioned earlier, it's quite dense with information, right? So we appreciate your patience. Lastly, the stormwater utility. Again, similar format, but it is not as complex as the water and sewer when we're looking at the overall obligations. Operating costs here, about $1.5 to $2.1 million for that particular time period. Again, here we do have additional staffing needs that have been included, so they are taking part of that capital project inspector, and there is also 100% funding of a stormwater quality technician included in these numbers. And so that's kind of why you see this bump here, is called the cost of living as well as the additional staffing support. No debt service in this particular utility at this particular time. Now we have a question.
Yeah.
Bill, yes, you have. Go ahead.
Just curious on the staffing. Just from the limited exposure I've had so far, I'm also new, and from the facility tours, the sort of shoestring staffing, as I would describe it, of the stormwater team in particular stood out. And just curious, what are the recommended staffing increases?
Great question. I'm actually glad it came up because the staffing for the stormwater is a bit split. So I'll give you a little background and then sort of tie it together at the end here. So last year we had some staff that departed the organization, and it allowed us to, anytime someone leaves the organization, that we look at our team and make sure that we're situated accordingly. In the last biennium, the Public Works Department sort of reshifted some divisions around, and with the staff departure this last year, allowed us to sort of further refine our stormwater and urban forestry program to more closely align those two functions of our operation teams. So the stormwater additional staff that you're seeing here is actually, it's not a full FTE, like one person. It's actually bits of people along the way. So it does include some stormwater quality tech functionality. It also includes our CIP inspectors. So one of the requests in the budget proposal is, with this additional capital work that we're doing, we're requesting another CIP inspector. We just have one capital improvement inspector on staff right now that is inspecting all of our public works projects. That's really, really small and really, really thin in terms of staff involvement for our capital work, especially with the amount of capital work that we're doing. Those CIP inspectors are split based off of their function, what utility they're working for. And so the piece of that CIP inspector that's hitting the stormwater group here is larger because the stormwater fund, the staffing model is smaller. So when you add that increase in FTE, it has a larger impact on the overall operational forecast as well. So does that make sense? But in a nutshell, there's a number of different staff that touch stormwater, including the manager, as well as a handful of team members as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, moving to the capital plan, and actually that was a great intro to this particular slide as well, in terms of the operating cost obligations and how we have to balance that with the capital cost obligations in terms of the stormwater utility. And so here again, 23 through 28, we have our annual capital obligations in the bars. Similar to the water and sewer utility, we see here in this green dotted line is the policy that we would at full policy phase in trying to implement, which would be about from the 800,000 mark to about the $1.2 million mark. What's happening in this particular utility, because of the additional operating cost pressures, is that we've tried to reduce the pressure that is being put on this particular utility from that policy. And so we have set it at 75% of the policy. So instead of, let's, for instance, $800,000 here funding in this year, we're actually looking at about a $600,000 funding. And we do slowly increase it so that we will ultimately get to the same point in terms of our overall target of about $1.2 million by 2028. But we have relaxed the policy slightly simply because there was putting additional pressure on the stormwater utility by trying to get to that target too quickly, as well as trying to staff up this particular program. And so what we have in this capital program is about $12.1 million in capital spending. Again, conveyance system, water course stabilization, and trunk line condition assessments being some of the larger costs. We are able, again, with our policy, even at the reduced, relaxed level, able to fund about $9.6 million with cash financing, or about 79%. There is a requirement in the latter years of a potential for a $2.5 million financing. That would be in the year 2027 and carry with it about $190,000 in new debt service. And so again, that will be addressed as we move out over time and continue the rate updates. Looking, oh, is there a question?
And I guess maybe this is really for Jason. If the debt financing is it tends to be tied to projects, what's the project that would be that you're looking for out in 2027?
I'm actually going to ask Matt or Patrick. They probably have it off the tip of their tongue. I don't have it in front of me.
Yeah.
I will say the stormwater side was a challenge. It was more of a challenge to find a project for this discussion than the other utilities. But Matt or Patrick, you have it in front of you?
And we do as well. I believe it was the conveyance system improvements, and you can confirm.
Yeah, that's correct.
I think that's what it was.
Great, thank you.
All right, I have a fairly simple question, which is in reading this chart, why are there on the vertical axis, why is there, 1 million, 1 million, 2 million, 2 million?
It's probably just rounding, I would imagine, Chase.
Yeah, I just updated that in my version I have open.
Is it supposed to be 500,000, 1 million, and then 1.52?
Correct, and so you can accept my apology that does the same thing on a slide next.
Okay, just.
Thank you for that. No, that's great. Good clarification.
0.5 that rounded to 1 and 1.5 that rounded to 2.
Yeah. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Okay, moving to again, combining operating and capital needs. We have 2023 through 24. Again, very similar bars are our expenses. We have our solid line at existing revenue levels, as well as the dotted line in terms of trying to define what the gap is in terms of meeting our future overall obligations. O&M expenses we have in the gray bar. So again, here, the big jump here is again, staffing requirements and COLA adjustments, etc. We have again in the green, the rate funded system reinvestment policy, again, trying to slowly continue that pace on to try to get to our target funding of about 1.2 million for the stormwater utility. And then there are some years, again, because we have relaxed that policy, that we do need additional funding from cash that is above the phased in system reinvestment policy. And that's represented in these kind of grid line bars here. And so in 2023 and 24, again, our existing revenue levels are enough to pay for our operating costs. However, as we start adding in our capital requirements, that is, again, when we start seeing that our existing revenue levels are not sufficient to support our cash funding needs. And we would have to, again, increase rates in order to meet that gap to achieve our capital program. That does look to be about 8% annual rate increases for this particular utility as well. A little different on the dollar side in terms of stormwater when we're talking percentages. So I'll go ahead and turn to this one here. Again, here we included bi-monthly, monthly bills. So the monthly bill currently is $19.91. That's at the bottom table. That would increase to $21.50 or $1.59 with the 8% increase in 23. If you continue the 8% increase in 24, that is about $1.72 to $23.22 for that sample single family bill on stormwater. So storm summary, again, rate increases are needed in 23 and 24, which is strictly just the time period that we're looking at here, about 8%. That equates to about $1.59 per month on the typical single family bill for 2023. We will come back and again review during the mid-biennial period for 2024 rate adjustments. Key drivers there, again, are the additional staffing needs, the additional capital costs identified, and the recent inflation, again, as we've saw with many of the other two utilities, the water and sewer utilities. Any questions on the stormwater? A couple more slides. So summary, again, just bringing everything together since we kind of started with water and worked through our way through sewer. So water, the average residential monthly increase is about $4.89 in 2023. Sewer is composed of that local as well as the King County charge. So the overall adjustment is $4.25 for 2023, with the local portion being $1.41 per month. And then the stormwater utility is $1.59 bill impact in 2023 for the proposed rate increases. And again, we did not address 2024 as that will be addressed during the mid-biennial review with staff.
Very good. Thank you. Appreciate the presentation, Ms. Sanchez. I see someone said the next steps, utility board come to consensus. That is an admirable goal. I would, as your chair, ask that we follow our published agenda, which calls for discussing storm first, the stormwater budget. I think it would be appropriate to, if the utility board can concur, let's consider ourselves a committee of the whole for a few moments at least, so as to have a less formal discussion. Is that acceptable to the other members of the utility board?
What was the question again, Tim?
Well, the question is, we have an agenda. The slide in front of you, George, says come to a consensus. I think as a formal matter, at some point we will have to make some motions, but I think it might be worthwhile to have a little more free of a discussion rather than go there. If that's acceptable to the rest of the board, constitute ourselves a committee of the whole and how to have a less formal discussion.
That seems great.
And I can stop sharing as well, so we can.
That might be helpful for a few moments, Angie. We probably will ask you to flash some stuff back up on the screen, but no one says we have to be consistent all the time, right?
No problem.
Well, and I did have a question just out of Angie's presentation, and we kind of specifically hit on it a number of times throughout the this concept of the reinvestment target. In the different utilities, what I think was the target was 3.9 million in water, 2 million in sewer, and 1.2 million in stormwater. Those, they don't have an obvious relationship to revenues. So my assumption then is that's probably relating to system repair costs, system value costs. But what is the actual formula that you guys are basing those kind of reinvestment targets on for the different utilities through time?
And during the last study, it was based on looking again at what I believe it was a 6-year capital program kind of obligation, typical capital program obligation look like, and that's where those particular numbers came from and the targets came from.
So literally an average of the kind of standard capital plan over a 6-year period of time.
Right.
Averaged over that 6-year period of time. Yep. Is that then excluding kind of large system or large upgrades in that CIP?
We kept it at the same. Yeah, we kept it at the same for this particular update. It would be higher for this update if it was strictly just looking at the 6-year capital program and increasing that. And so we kind of had limited it to, we kind of started this particular pace in 2020. We were trying to get to the 3.9 target. Still made sense in terms of magnitude of the particular project that you all are looking at. And so it is actually lower than what it would be if we were strictly just looking at all capital projects, 6-year program. What would that particular number be today? if that makes sense.
So is there like a kind of a ratio then of what that kind of, again, looking at the perfect thing that we're trying to design for, which of course never happens, but that we're designing for that perfect thing, if it's, is it 50-50 in terms of like ongoing rate-based funded versus debt funding, kind of, or is it a 60-40, or is it not even really looked at as a hard and fast kind of ratio between them, and just based on, well, looking at this particular 6 years, it looks kind of like this?
Yeah, and I would say ideally what you had described would be perfect. Is if you're really trying to set some different policy parameters of really all system reinvestment funding, to the extent possible, would be cash financed, and really only capacity enhancing regulatory, requirements, long life, maybe projects would be considered debt financing. So putting those particular parameters on that is ideal. However, it was not at that sophisticated during the particular initial setting of these particular projects. And so it was just looked at the 6-year plan and a number set to try to get to that target.
So over the long enough period of time, the goal would literally be to get it so that no additional debt financing would be required through time, and you'd be your reinvestment number annually would relatively be close to your just general PIP budget.
Yeah, in a more mature system that does not have a lot of growth or capacity enhancing type of needs in terms of improvements, many times you will switch over from more debt financing to more repair and replacement, because again, you're just trying to keep up with what's being worn out in terms of the systems.
Well, and so Tim, just as a math thing, if you think of it over a 20-year period of time, if it took you 20 years to move from your debt financed to a reinvestment or the rate based, you would basically end up at the same point where you'd be spending the same amount of money each year in the rate based as you would have otherwise been paying in debt, and you would have paid off to most of the debt through that period of time.
Fair enough. If you were a resident for the whole 20 years, it is reminiscent of what John Maynard Keynes once said, in the long run, we're all dead. So you got to take it all with a grain of salt, I suppose. Because conversely, of course, so much of the island's infrastructure was built at a particular point in time, right? And the island was really growing as a bedroom community in the late 50s, into the 70s, which means it's all going to need to be replaced at fairly specific point in time, and is what we're looking at. So, the one way to look at it is 20 years from now, it won't make a difference. Another way to look at it is right now we've got an elephant passing through a snake. And so it's a question of how we pay for it right now.
So
yeah,
oh, go ahead, Steve.
Go ahead, Meredith. No, I have to go ahead.
So I apologize if this has been asked before. And this policy, that you're describing to us, Angie, this is a policy that the city council, the city has adopted, or where's it coming from? Is it required by statute? Is it best practices and the city has made some formal adoption of it? Angie, you're still muted.
In my understanding, it was a budget policy in the 2019, 2020. I'm not sure if it preceded that or not, but it was a budget policy. So I don't know if those are formally approved by council or not, but it was a kind of a budget policy for those particular time frames. I would say this is a best practice. Not a lot of you are ahead of the game. Let's just put it that way in terms of looking at including a component in your rates for system reinvestment. Many times when we go into utilities and complete rate studies, this is the one piece that's missing. And the reason why it's missing is because it's the easiest thing to cut. If there's rate pressure, people will generally cut capital and defer projects. And unfortunately, the projects don't go away. The mountain just gets farther out, and it eventually will hit you, and you will have to climb it. But that is kind of what we're trying to prevent with this particular policy. And again, I would say would be more of a best practice. I wouldn't say that there's a lot of it. So the city of Bellevue, for instance, has a wonderful system reinvestment policy. They have reaped the benefits of that because they can do a lot of funding of capital projects through existing reserves, built up reserves, because they've had these policies in places. But not a lot of entities, jurisdictions have this, because it does put pressure on rates. And so it is that balancing act of how much can we chew off, how much can we continue to try to cut that deferred maintenance without getting too far behind.
And so is some of this because there's going to be maintenance and or upgrades that aren't quite big enough for big capital financing? Is that the thought, or just that it's a different way to fund?
It's a different way to fund because of the type of project, because it's repair and replacement. You will try to generally, include cash financing for at least some of that repair and replacement. But again, it all kind of depends on how open the city is to debt financing at different levels.
Right. Matt, do you know, I mean, this is maybe an unfair question since you're new, when it became a budget policy for the city, tell me what that means.
Well, it means that it essentially was set. We're having a dialogue behind the scenes here among staff to try to figure out the origins of the policy. What we can confirm this, but what we believe is that it was adopted by the utility board decades ago. And so because it is an established best practice, and when we run the numbers and we crunch the numbers and we run them again, it just shows that this is in our enlightened self-interest to keep a policy like this in place. We don't mess with smart policy. So we've kept it in place.
Great, thank you.
And then the only trick to that is, of course, that dial can be, it is not a fixed percentage. It is not a fixed target. Like you showed in the stormwater system, there is you can make rationales that, in a particularly challenging economic time, et cetera, maybe it isn't appropriate to be trying to race towards that target quite as quickly, which would, but it doesn't require, that doesn't actually, of course, reduce the volume of CIP projects that you're trying to fund. It just means you've got less funding out of cash flow, and you're going to end up having to take out more debt in order to do it. And I think we were seeing on those graphs, even taking out the debt for it is still takes a pretty healthy bite out of the budget, the annual debt service on those. So even on a 20-year period.
Other discussion?
I've got a question.
Yes, George.
First of all, that was a great presentation, Angie. Thank you. What is kind of making my clothes itch a little bit here is these percent increases those are big numbers. 8% is a big number. And what I'm not seeing, but I'm kind of curious about it, is back in the day, we would call it a sensitivity analysis. And that is, suppose that instead of being an advisory board, we were a regulatory authority, and we had legislative power to deny or amend any of your rate increases. And we told you, under no uncertain terms will you be allowed a rate increase greater than 5%, period. What does that mean, or what would that mean in terms of this proposal? Would it mean violating a policy? Would it mean eliminating crucial projects? I think that would be helpful information to the decision makers on the council to see to do kind of this what if analysis. And it doesn't have to be 5%, it could be some other number, but everything here is cost driven, and it makes total logical sense. But from a policy perspective or a decision-making perspective, what if you did get it? What does that mean? And that's what I'm kind of curious about.
And just to respond to that, so the tool set that we have in terms of rate modeling capabilities can provide sensitivity analyses. The unfortunate part is we can absolutely do that. It would likely mean that you're going to have to defer capital. And so you run the risk of what does that mean in terms of the various different capital deferrals. But we can run that.
I would just add that's what it's likely to be. So your the preliminary capital program that's been presented to the council, that's been talked about, we would likely have to defer projects into out years, and that's likely what would take place. You don't have a lot of wiggle room on your operation side to skinny things up. It's really your capital work that's going to be the focus.
Will first.
Yeah, I have a question along the same lines, although it's softer, and this is my first experience with this process. But the city has a comprehensive plan. It has stated vision, values, sustainability goals, economic goals. Is there any kind of work that's done as this gets communicated to council to connect how these recommendations connect to community values and broader sustainability and economic goals, or maybe even supports or advances those goals? Do we talk about this like that, or do we just not do that?
We are certainly mindful of the other goals that we have as a city, as an organization. The sustainability division is a component within Public Works, and so that in particular is being intertwined with both our operational and our capital work on a routine daily basis. It's much more in sync now than it was previously. As far as the economic goals, the way you're referring to it, we don't necessarily talk about it like that at the council level. We are mindful of those goals as an organization, and obviously we're working towards meeting all of our goals, not just the focus of the water system plan or the sewer system plan, the general sewer plan, or the stormwater conveyance work. We are a city, and the work that we do is part of the city as an organization as a whole. And so it's not just, it's a little bit different for us in terms of how utility districts work. My ops manager who's on the call would definitely attest to that. But so yes and no. It's not quite as well versed as you put it tonight.
Stephen.
Yeah, my question is, it was brought up that part of the increase is due to the pass-through costs, the costs of sewer and water that we reimburse Seattle for, and part of it is the increase in our O&M, but it wasn't broken down into how much that actually is. So, if you had to guess, how much would rates have to increase just to keep up with that?
So on the
water utility,
yeah.
For all of them in general.
So for the wastewater utility, I think that was broken out, and that was shown in the treatment portion of the costs. And so that was back when we were kind of breaking out the bill in terms of the local portion is really what the city operating costs are, but the King County wastewater treatment, that really is driven by that the overall costs that are passed through to us and then to the customer. Seattle, we did not include that particular piece. I see that Chase is kind of trying to work diligently right now to see if he can get you that number. So we will work and try to get that number. If not, then we will follow up with you and we can break that out.
I'm going to try to encourage the good behavior by raising hands. But Steve, you go. You first.
Well, thanks. Well, so I guess this is again coming back around to the reinvestment thing. That concept of so when George was asking about what does it look like if we were trying to target, say, a 6% rate increase versus an 8% increase, and understanding what that looks like in Jason, you mentioned that that could mean pushing projects into out years, but I think what Chair O'Connell is talking about, or is mentioning, or we're not necessarily saying that we don't want to get the projects done and that we don't want to see them paid for, but changing the ratio between rate-based reinvestment and debt-based reinvestment affects what what the rate increase has to be through time in order to keep up with that slope. but it doesn't specifically require that we don't do the projects or that we push them down the road. It's just that more of them become debt funded versus rate funded. So in terms of now, I think, is it around 40% or 50% rate-based versus debt-based ratio, kind of as it sits now? It looked like there's some amount of money that comes from surplus that goes back into the capital budget. And then there's the amount that's from the actual reinvestment portion that goes into the capital budget. And then there's the funds from lending that goes into that capital budget. So, across those, is it roughly 50-50? Would that be kind of where it's been targeted or where it ended up even, I guess?
Yeah, and I think in the capital,
I guess those slides showed it, didn't they? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It showed it was actually more like 56 or so, 56-45 debt to rate funded in the water system slide.
Yeah. And I'd be happy to go back to the slide as well, but I think you hit it on the nail ahead when you said that there's different levers, right, that we can pull in terms of how are we going to look at the overall rate increases and potentially, saying if we needed to cap it at the 5%, what are the levers that we need to push and pull in order to keep it under that 5%? And can we still keep it under that, let's say 5%, if we reduce the system reinvestment funding and took out more debt? How much debt capacity will I get if I do that? And by really trying to play with that overall level of system reinvestment funding. So you are going to, if you're not going to defer capital, then you're going to kind of look at, okay, well, then I'm going to need to debt finance more of that. And if I debt finance more and don't want to move any capital, can I actually keep it under that 5% adjustment, or no, would it really need more?
And how close are we to our kind of debt cap in that sense? You mentioned some of the debt coverage ratios that were required, and how close are we to that, as far as, because that again, it sets how much more debt you can even turn up. So
that's right. And we always look at those and make sure that you're not infringing on any of those particular policies. And sometimes debt coverage becomes the driver. So instead of a cash flow issue, it then becomes making sure that you're maintaining a certain debt service coverage requirement or minimum that we need to meet. And so again, that's one of those parameters that as we're looking at these sensitivity analyses, we're able to make sure that we're keeping within those various different financial parameters as well.
And
thank you.
Thank you for asking at least part of my question for me. And so what I'm curious about is just that issue. Because I hope we're not hearing, at least from me, and I think most of the members of this council, that we're anxious to defer needed capital improvements to our system. And I mean, just to be blunt about it, I think it's just a question of how do you pay for it. I think the point was made earlier, most of the improvements to the water system have useful lives well in excess of 20, right? Most of the in the ground have useful lives that are 50 to 75 years, not 20. And so it is a question of, how do you pay for a long-term capital improvement, and why do you pay for long-term capital improvement at a current fund? And that's the question that I'd like for us to have a discussion about. For example, we talked about it when we had your slides on the screen, that we are looking at debt financing for the water utility. And my focus is on the water utility because that's where the big money is, right? I mean, we're talking about $26 million in capital improvements in the next biennium for the water utility, dwarfs the other two put together. So since that's supposed to be an 8% smoothed increase, what happens if we start looking at capital being raised through debt in the out years? I mean, what does that do to our smoothing function? I shared George's concern. I mean, an 8% increase every year, as far as the eye can see, is a daunting proposition.
Tim, can I agree that that's a daunting.
Well, Meredith, I'd like, just a sec, I'd like to hear if anybody can answer that question that I asked from staff. Is Angie or Matt, I mean, has anyone looked at that?
We did not run that sensitivity analysis at this time, but again, we have the tool set to be able to do that. And so again, this is kind of what we're giving an initial, view of what some of the results had stated. And again, working with Jason and Matt and Ben, we would be happy to go back and look at some of those options if that is something that the utility board is interested in looking at. But again, Jason and Matt, I will look to you to answer that as well.
Yeah, I think so. Tim, my question follows up on that, which is it's a bit of a softball, but I thought I heard Jason say early in this that or maybe it was Matt, that they've actually looked at and for projects that could be long-term financed and tried to put all of those essentially into the long-term financing. And maybe then the answer to the question Tim just asked, Jason, I don't know if you have an answer to that now or whether this is an answer that's going to come after we do the some kind of sensitivity analysis.
So I think Matt and I can probably tag team on this. So we have met a handful of times over the course of the past, 12, 16 months, Matt, to talk about a number of different projects that could fall into this debt financing discussion. I will say one of the hiccups that we have run into, or one of the challenges we've run into, in particular now with COVID delays, is the time frame in which we actually have to complete the projects within. So when we fund a project through debt financing, I believe the requirement is we have to complete the project within the 3-year time frame. Some of the projects that we have right now, just given the size of those projects, and I'll use the booster chlorination station project, the booster project as an example, where this project started quite a while ago, and it's underway. It's under construction. There was some engineering delays early on, and now followed by some material delays, some pretty significant material delays on the COVID side. So we've been treading carefully in terms of what projects may or may not fit for this discussion. We can certainly talk about what projects and provide a recommendation on which projects we think would be applicable. And if this is the direction that we want to go, or we choose to go, we just have to be very mindful that this work has to get done within that 3-year time frame, right? So we don't violate any of the issues associated with issuing debt for these projects. So we have to be very diligent and calculated in how we go about doing it.
Is that part of that also basically making the projects into kind of smaller chunks, but then you have the issue of you have to raise the bond on that smaller project, and that's too small, and then the lending costs get higher based on the total debt raised?
Correct.
That's part of the reason why you see us aiming for an issuance in 2023 for a large sum of money, because we save money by issuing less frequently. And we also did it on the off years of the budget process because it is a burden on staff time. So we're just trying to be cognizant of using our staff resources as strategically as we can as well. We just for context, the lending environment has also changed significantly over the past 12 months. And so we at the project that Jason has highlighted, 2 projects that he's highlighted tonight, the booster chlorination system and the water reservoir improvements combined for over $9 million of improvements. We went out for a Public Works Board loan in early September of this year, totaling over $9.5 million, trying to secure outside funding for those projects at a rate between 0.6 to 1.3%. So very competitive rate in an environment when we're seeing 4 to 4.5% lending costs. We won't know whether or not we were successful in those applications until late November. This is through the Department of Commerce, and we've been in communication with them, and they're going to get back to all the applicants at the end of November. So we had to assume that we were not going to get that outside funding. But I just wanted to add the context here is that we're being aggressive with pursuing outside funding, because all signs are pointing to the interest rate climate only becoming less friendly for this kind of lending. Our economists are saying at our bond council today told us that we should anticipate about 125 basis points increase the policy rates for the Fed by the end of the year. And so that's likely to change rates once again.
Meredith, do you have another question, or did you not lower your hand? All right. Anyone else? Any further discussion? All right. Hearing none, let's return to regular order. And the first item on our agenda is the stormwater budget and rate discussion. Does anyone care to make a motion regarding the stormwater rate recommendation?
I mean, so that was back to that question that we had asked Angie and the staff. And I would say, hey, the trick is the staff needs to task the consulting agency with this, right? So as the question, I think the thrust of a lot of our question is what does what would this rate increase look like if we change the dial a little bit on that? And is it possible? Is that the kind of the sum of what you're talking about, Jason? Is that we really can't put that many more projects into the debt funding basis because of problems of breaking them up into too small projects, or breaking them, or they're taking too long to finish them, or that you feel you have already basically identified all of the appropriate projects for debt financing, and so therefore the exercise of changing that analysis would be irrelevant because there aren't the right projects to put in that bucket for additional debt financing yet. I'm not, or is the answer no? There's probably a few more projects that we could push into the debt financing bucket, and so we could look at what it looks like to do a little bit higher debt financing in comparison to the rate-based, and stretch the rate-based target date out an extra couple of years before we hit that 3.9, 2.0, 1.2 levels.
That's a good question. I will say my gut reaction right now is for the 23-24 biennium that we're talking about. The projects that we've identified for debt financing are probably the appropriate projects for that biennium. Now, whether or not projects in out years can be evaluated and looked at, right? So years 3 through 6 and beyond. I think that's a really good conversation and something that we can look at internally. But I think for 23 and 24, the 2 years in this biennium, I think the project that we've identified are the right projects already.
Gotcha. Okay, well, I mean, I think based on that concept, that in my eyes, since we're again technically only talking about 1 year of rates is what we're really voting for. We're suggesting that kind of 2-year biennium number with understanding that the 2024 is going to get reviewed again before it goes into effect. It seems reasonable to try and I don't see any quibbling with the number for this year. We know that this year is a heavy expense year, so I would. We were talking about specifically on storm.
Correct. I'd like a motion on storm, Steve.
Yeah, so I would motion that we approve the recommended storm rate change for the 2023-2024, and I guess with that caveat that we would like to see what on the next batch of these numbers, especially when we come back to the 2024 review, understanding what some other projects in those next bienniums would be able to be looked at for debt financing, so we can understand what it looks like to stretch out the rate-based reinvestment target out an extra couple of years, rather than kind of racing to it quite as quickly as the current budget looks like.
Yeah, those are good comments. I agree. Yeah.
Right. I'll second it.
Meredith, I construed Will's comments as being a second. But you're almost quick enough.
Either way, Bill, it's all yours.
Moved by Member Milton, seconded by Member Borcorni, that the board recommend the staff's rate increase for the 23-24 biennium of 8%, with the understanding that by the time the 24 review comes around, we will evaluate longer term debt financing options. Is that a fair way to phrase it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay, there's a motion on the table that's been on the floor. Excuse me. There's a motion on the floor that has been seconded. Is there further discussion of that motion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 George, I didn't get your vote.
Aye.
I thought I saw you nod your head, but I didn't hear you.
Giving you the silent treatment.
Well, it's not the first time and not the last, I'm sure. Okay, so I think then, any opposed? No opposed. So that recommendation passes unanimously. Next is sewer. Staff's recommendation is a 4.5% increase in the next biennium. Is there a motion?
I'll move.
And what is your motion, Member Marshall?
To approve the 4.5% increase.
Very good. Is there a second for that?
I'll second.
Thank you, Member Quartz. Thank you. Discussion.
I would just like to amend the motion to include kind of the same caveat that we discussed on the storm budget.
Is that, well, I'm trying to remember whose motion. It was, George, it was your motion. Is that, do you consider that a friendly amendment?
I consider that a friendly amendment and a very good recommendation.
Very good. Further discussion. Hearing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor of the motion with the friendly amendment, please say aye.
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 And again, I think that passed unanimously. Well, I'll go ahead. Any opposed? No, passes unanimously. Next are the water rates. Here's the big kahuna. Can I get a motion regarding the water rates? I'll let this die for lack of a motion, folks.
Just giving time for anyone that wanted to step forward on it. I'll move to approve the recommended water budget rates from or the water rates from staff of the 8% increase for 2023 and 2024, with the same caveat made on the previous two approvals.
Very good. Is there a second for that motion?
I'll second
it. Meredith got in first there, George. So moved by Member Milton, seconded by Member Blair to accept the recommendation of staff for an 8% increase in the biennium for both years of the biennium 2023-2024, with the recommendation and expectation that we'll be reviewing the potential for further debt financing in out years. Is that a fair characterization, Milton, of your motion?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, there's a motion that's been seconded on the floor. Discussion. Hearing no further discussion, I'll call the question. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hear none. So again, minutes should reflect that passed unanimously. Very good. Folks, we've been at this for about 2 hours and we've gotten, I think, a very good discussion going on. on behalf of the board, I will express my appreciation, Jason, to you and the city staff, and Angie, you and your team. Thank you very much for the work that you did on this. It's been very helpful to everybody. Yeah. Traditionally, when we present this to the city council on the that's on the 15th, isn't it, Jason?
Yes,
I'll be there, and I have a good set of recommendations to make to the council on behalf of the board.
So my quick question, the reason I have my hand up is I'm wondering, will the slides that we saw, which I thought were really nicely done and were nice and clear for me, are they something that will automatically come to us or can be sent to us?
We can absolutely send them to you, and they'll be, since they were presented here on the recorded meeting, they'll be available for the general public to review as well, but we'll send the actual PowerPoint slide deck out to the full board.
That would be very helpful. And does that include, I know you said it was an appendix, but if it was, I didn't see it, the historical rate summary that we talked about? Yeah, because I would very much like to see that.
Me too.
Absolutely.
All right, last item of business on our agenda is our work plan, which was in your agenda packet. It contemplates that we don't have a November meeting. Although, as I said, on the 15th, I'll be in front of the council. And then on the 13th, Jason, can you give us a preview of what you've got contemplated there?
Yep. So as part of the solid waste contract that the city has with Recology, they provide an annual report each year to the city. So the December meeting will be, Recology will be there to present their annual report. With that presentation will include the solid waste rate discussion. It's part of the contract. There's, for the new board members, there's some nuances associated with the contract. There's a commodity adjustment mechanism. So you have your standard CPI and your tipping fees that are sort of pre-baked or pre-established by, you know, the county and some other regulations that are associated with it. But then we have a commodity adjustment mechanism where the recyclable commodities that the community recycles each year generates a credit or could actually hurt us if the market sort of tails off. So that always helps. Recently it's helped soften the rates a bit. And my early preview for this is it's doing the same, although not quite as well as the last couple of years. But nevertheless, Recology will be here to present that information. There's a new general manager for Recology. They've had quite a bit of staff turnover this last year. So it will be a new team for the utility board to meet at Recology, which I think will be helpful for everyone. And if you have some burning solid waste questions, now's your time to bring them. So prepare and feel free to fire away at them with those questions when they're here in December. And then the second part to the December meeting will be a preview of the 2023 work plan. And then I will just say, based off of tonight's discussion, I think it will be advantageous to, as staff, as we referenced earlier, staff has been meeting with our debt consultants along the way. And I think it'd be helpful if we can just provide some small check-ins on the work plan for this board through the course of next year. And we'll just sort of keep you up to date on, you know, what we're hearing, some of the projects that we're looking at, you know, sort of in the out years, to the motions that were generated tonight, so that, you know, full transparency, and we can start working through this discussion early next year rather than just, hey, in October, November sort of thing. So I think the board would probably appreciate that, and we'll make sure we add that to the work plan. So
Jason,
that's what's in store for December.
I very much appreciate you saying that, because I really do think, you know, the members of this board try to give some thoughtful advice to you and to the city, and a better base of information is better for all of that. So
absolutely,
I very much appreciate your expression there. Can I ask you a question though about the Recology presentation that we are anticipating in I'm right, aren't I? That's informative. This is not a situation where the council is asking for our recommendation about the rate. The rate is what the rate is under the contract.
Correct. The rate is what the rate is under the contract. It's really an update of, you know, how does it all pencil out at the end of the day for 2022 as we move into 2023. I think it's interesting to look at what the commodity market has done over the course of the year, because they sample our recycling at 3 different times throughout the course of the year. And, you know, at one time, cardboard values could be really high and plastic could be really low, or the inverse could happen, and how that impacts our commodity adjustment mechanism. So, you know, it's also a good time to ask questions. I will say, internally, staff have received some additional complaints this year from perhaps missed service or missed collections, and it's a good opportunity to say, hey, what happened? Why? You know, where are your numbers? You know, what's happening over the course of the year? You know, I will say, we meet with the recology team monthly, and at times there's some very valid reasons for it. Trucks break down, like things happen, high heat. You know, they don't get to all the collections. And other times it's like, hey, there's something going on here, and it's an opportunity to make sure they course correct as they head into the next year, because that's an important piece of their contract. Well, and equally, it's important to look at what those are over kind of big picture, right? I mean, it's easy to base your assumption on an anecdote you hear from your neighbor or from your own. Does the city keep any of that on any kind of a statistical basis, volume of complaints? Is there any one complaint predominant, that type of thing? Yes, that's actually a great question. Our customer service team does track the calls that come in. And so I've actually asked for that data to sort of keep our own internal recording of what calls we are receiving. Because I would say one of the key elements of the solid waste contract was their local call center when we went with the procurement process. And so they have their own call center, they have their own data and stats, but we also keep ours for internally as well. So if things rise to our level, we're keeping track of what those calls and complaints are, so that we can address those issues. Will you be able to include that in the discussion in December? Because I think it would be very helpful to hear what some of those overall kind of concerns are. Absolutely. I mean, 4 weeks ago, I was late bringing my garbage can out, and I know the guy saw me, but he just kept on going. You know, so I'm not going to let that fade my overall impression of recology, right? I mean, you know, so that's a one-off. That's an anecdote. That's an anecdote.
You sure, Tim? You sure? You sure you're not going to let that impact you?
Just that I remember it, that I might recount it. You know, I don't know. That's why I want the big picture. The big picture. Very good. We'll look forward to that, and we'll look forward to developing the work plan for the following year. Any further business for the good of the body? Hearing none, we've already had a long evening, so I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Discussion? Seconded. Discussion? Hearing none, I'll declare us adjourned. Thank you, everybody. It was a very, very good meeting.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tim, thanks for your help with the logistics.
No problem, Meredith. Happy to help. Glad your husband's okay and that you were able to get back.
Me too. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Good night.